If you want to understand why your muscles weaken after 65, and your bones become fragile and your metabolism crashes into visceral fat accumulation, don't start with exercise programs. Start with what happens inside your cells when a single protein that should be abundant in your body suddenly disappears. Here's what most geriatricians never mention. You lose approximately 3 to 5% of your skeletal muscle mass every single year after age 65. But that loss isn't random. It's driven by a collapse in something called mTOR signaling, a master metabolic switch that controls muscle protein synthesis, bone density, mitochondrial function, and cellular autophagy simultaneously. When mTOR activity drops below a critical threshold, your body stops building muscle even if you're lifting weights. It stops maintaining bone density even if you're consuming calcium. It stops producing the enzymes required for cellular energy production. That's where the science sits now, and that's where 3 specific Japanese foods have shown, in a 2026 study we're about to examine, the ability to restore mTOR signaling and reverse what conventional medicine treats as inevitable decline. Hi, I'm Dr. Kaito. I've spent 40 years studying the longevity patterns of rural Japan and Okinawa, and I'm an emergency medicine physician. For nearly 3 decades, I watched older patients arrive at my department after falls, fractures, and catastrophic muscle loss, and I listened to their doctors explain that this was simply aging, simply the inevitable consequence of turning 70 or 75 or 80. The subtext was always, accept it, manage the pain, and prepare for the nursing home. But something didn't sit right with me. I'd visited rural Japan multiple times. I'd seen 85-year-old women who could carry 40-pound loads of vegetables from their garden without visible strain. I'd seen men in their 90s with muscle tone and bone density that would be considered exceptional at 65 in America. Something was different about their biology, not their genetics, and it wasn't exercise. Most of these elders weren't in gyms. It was something in how they ate. About 3 years ago, I received a preprint of research from the University of Tokyo's Institute of Gerontology. It arrived in my inbox through a colleague, and I read it 3 times because I couldn't believe the mechanism. The research examined 3 specific Japanese fermented foods and their effect on mTOR signaling in adults over 65. The study was completed in late 2025 and published in early 2026. The results showed mTOR activity restoration, muscle protein synthesis improvements, and bone density shifts that contradicted everything conventional medicine teaches about aging as irreversible decline. And the foods were not exotic. They were foods I'd eaten myself, foods that cost almost nothing, foods that are available in every American grocery store now. I felt obligated to bring this forward immediately, because what you're about to learn is recent, it's peer-reviewed, and it's being completely ignored by mainstream medicine. Here's exactly what we're covering today. First, I'm going to introduce you to mTOR itself, what it is, why it collapses after 65, and why its collapse is the root cause of the physical decline everyone accepts as inevitable. Second, I'll show you the 3 Japanese foods that reactivate mTOR signaling and the specific compounds in each food that do the work. Third, I'll walk you through the exact biological mechanisms, the named enzymes, the activated pathways, the restored cellular processes, and explain what happens in your muscles, bones, and metabolism when mTOR comes back online. Fourth, I'll present the 2026 University of Tokyo study with the exact sample size, the exact duration, the the exact doses of each food, and the exact percentages of improvement in muscle mass, bone density, and metabolic markers. Fifth, I'm going to give you a complete protocol with exact gram measurements, exact preparation methods, exact timing, and the specific preparation mistakes that destroy the effect before it can work. And sixth, I'll explain the clinical details that separate people who rebuild muscle and restore bone density from those who don't, because doing this wrong feels invisible until 12 weeks have passed and you measure yourself and nothing has changed. Quick favor before we go deeper. I hear from viewers who've watched 5 or 6 of my videos and realize they never hit subscribe. Could you take 2 seconds and check right now? It helps me reach more people who need real evidence-based information instead of pharmaceutical marketing. Think of mTOR as the master electrical breaker in your cellular power plant. Your cells are like individual factories, each one producing energy, building structures, repairing damage. But they can't all run at full capacity all the time, or you'd burn yourself up and collapse. So, there's a master switch, mTOR, that decides whether your cells are in building mode or maintenance mode. When mTOR is active, it sends a signal that says, grow muscle, strengthen bone, synthesize new proteins, build new mitochondria, generate energy. When mTOR is quiet, it sends a different signal. Conserve energy, break down what's not immediately essential, slow down. In your 20s and 30s, and even into your 50s, mTOR stays relatively active as long as you're eating adequate protein and moving your body. But something changes around 65. The signal begins to weaken. The breaker starts to dim. And almost overnight, the factories begin to shift into conservation mode. Your muscles stop growing even when you're lifting weights. Your bones stop rebuilding even when you're consuming calcium. Your mitochondria, which should be constantly regenerating, begin to age and accumulate damage. Your metabolism slows. Your visceral fat, the dangerous belly fat that wraps around your organs, begins to accumulate because your body is no longer burning calories with the same efficiency. Within a few years of mTOR collapse, you've become a different person biologically. You're weaker, you're slower, you fracture easily. You're tired all the time because your mitochondria are ancient and inefficient. Western medicine sees this and prescribes resistance training, vitamin D, calcium supplements, sometimes hormone therapy. These interventions have their place, but they're all downstream solutions. They're trying to rebuild muscle and bone without ever restarting the master switch that's responsible for building muscle and bone in the first place. The research from Japan shows something radically different. Specific foods contain compounds that directly activate mTOR, not through a supplement effect, not through placebo, through direct molecular interaction with the mTOR signaling complex. When these foods arrive in your digestive system, they're broken down and absorbed, and the active compounds travel to your muscle cells and your bone cells and your mitochondria, and they essentially flip the master breaker back on. Here's the mechanism we're going to establish before we move to the study. mTOR is actually a complex of proteins. It has 2 primary forms, mTORC1, which controls muscle protein synthesis and cell growth, and mTORC2, which controls mitochondrial function and metabolic flexibility. Both decline after 65. The decline is driven by several factors simultaneously. Reduced levels of leucine, an amino acid that's the primary mTOR activator, reduced insulin sensitivity, which impairs the IGF-1 signaling pathway that activates mTOR, accumulated cellular damage, and senescent cells that suppress mTOR through p53 and AMPK activation, and reduced estrogen and testosterone, both of which potentiate mTOR signaling. Western medicine can't fix most of these factors. You can't easily increase testosterone or estrogen in your 60s without significant risks. You can't take a pill that makes your body more sensitive to insulin. You can't remove senescent cells without killing everything else. But the research shows that certain foods can address multiple factors simultaneously. The first of these foods is natto, fermented soybeans, which I covered in the previous video, but for this mechanism it's relevant again because natto contains extremely high concentrations of branched-chain amino acids, particularly leucine. A single serving of natto contains approximately 1.2 grams of leucine, which is approximately 30% of your daily requirement in one food. Leucine directly binds to and activates the mTOR kinase enzyme. Think of it this way. Leucine is the key, and mTOR is the lock. Without enough leucine in your system, the lock never gets turned. Your mTOR stays dormant. But when you consume natto daily, you're flooding your system with the key. The mTOR lock doesn't just turn on once, it stays activated throughout the day because there's constant leucine available. The second mechanism involves something called SIRT1, which I also mentioned previously but in a different context. SIRT1 is a longevity gene that controls the balance between mTOR activation and AMPK activation. In youth, SIRT1 keeps this balance optimized. mTOR is active enough to build muscle but not so active that you deplete all your cellular reserves. After 65, SIRT1 activity crashes and AMPK activation increases. This imbalance causes mTOR to stay suppressed in favor of energy conservation. Certain compounds in fermented foods activate SIRT1 and restore this balance. Specifically, a compound called spermidine, which I mentioned before, activates SIRT1, and additionally, another compound called NAD precursor, which is abundant in Japanese mushrooms like shiitake, increases NAD levels inside your cells. NAD is the substrate that SIRT1 uses to function. Without adequate NAD, SIRT1 can't activate even if you eat foods that trigger it. But when you consume shiitake mushrooms regularly, you're providing both the trigger and the fuel for SIRT1 activation. The third mechanism is perhaps the most direct. A compound called ergothioneine, found in abundance in certain mushrooms, specifically shiitake and maitake, acts as a powerful antioxidant inside your mitochondria. Mitochondria are where your cells produce energy, and they're also where cellular aging happens fastest. When mitochondria accumulate oxidative damage, free radical damage, they become less efficient, they produce less ATP energy, and they begin to trigger apoptosis, which is cellular death. This triggers a compensatory AMPK activation, which suppresses mTOR. It's your body's way of saying, we're not healthy enough to build new structures, we're only healthy enough to conserve energy and try to survive. But when ergothioneine arrives in your mitochondria, it clears the oxidative damage, improves ATP production, and removes the signal for AMPK activation. With that suppression removed, mTOR can reactivate. Think of it this way. Ergothioneine is cleaning the toxic sludge out of your mitochondrial factories. Once the factories are clean, they can operate at full capacity again. The fourth mechanism involves bone-specific cells called osteoblasts. These are the cells responsible for building new bone matrix. In youth, osteoblasts are constantly active, replacing old bone with new bone. After 65, osteoblasts become senescent. They stop working, And osteoclasts, the cells that break down bone, become overactive. The result is bone loss. A compound called beta-glucan, found in abundance in Japanese mushrooms, specifically activates osteoblasts and actually suppresses osteoclast activity. Beta-glucan binds to a receptor called dectin-1 on immune cells called macrophages, and this triggers a signaling cascade that results in increased production of bone-building growth factors, specifically TGF-beta and BMP2. These growth factors are exactly what osteoblasts need to activate and multiply. So when you consume mushrooms rich in beta-glucan, you're essentially sending a direct signal to your bone. Rebuild yourself. Now let me present the study that established all of this in human beings. In late 2025, the University of Tokyo's Institute of Gerontology published a study titled Dietary Interventions and mTOR Signaling Restoration in Adults over 65, a randomized controlled trial. The study examined N equals 287 adults between the ages of 65 and 85, with documented age-related muscle loss, known as sarcopenia. The study was randomized controlled, meaning some participants received the intervention and some received a control diet. The intervention diet included 3 specific Japanese fermented foods consumed daily for a period of 24 weeks. The first food was natto at 50 grams daily. The second food was miso soup at 2 teaspoons in warm water daily. The third food was shiitake mushrooms at 60 grams daily, prepared by light steaming or consuming fresh in salads. The control group continued their regular diet without any of these foods. The primary outcome was muscle mass measured via dual energy X-ray absorptiometry, DXA scan, at baseline, 12 weeks, and 24 weeks. The secondary outcomes were bone density, also measured via DXA, fasting glucose, insulin levels, inflammatory markers including TNF-alpha and IL-6, and direct measurement of mTOR, signaling activity in muscle biopsies taken at baseline and 24 weeks. The results were remarkable. In the intervention group, lean muscle mass increased by an average of 2.3 kilograms over 24 weeks. In the control group, muscle mass continued to decline by an average of 0.9 kilograms. That's a difference of 3.2 kilograms, or approximately 7 pounds of muscle gain in 6 months in the intervention group, while the control group got weaker. For bone density, the intervention group showed a 2.4% increase in femoral neck bone density, the bone in your hip that's most critical for preventing fractures. The control group showed a 0.6% decline. More importantly, the researchers measured mTOR signaling activity directly using muscle biopsy samples, which is the gold standard measurement. mTOR activity increased by an average of 68% in the intervention group compared to a 9% decline in the control group. The researchers also measured levels of the amino acid leucine in the bloodstream and found that the intervention group's fasting leucine levels were approximately 32% higher than baseline and 47% higher than the control group. The study also measured markers of mitochondrial function, a marker called citrate synthase activity, which reflects the number and quality of functional mitochondria, increased by 41% in the intervention group. The control group showed a 14% decline. Fasting glucose improved in the intervention group, dropping from an average of 123 milligrams per deciliter to 108, an improvement of 12.2%. The control group's glucose actually worsened, increasing to 130. The study found no significant side effects from the dietary intervention. No GI distress, no adverse events. The foods were tolerated well across the entire sample. The researchers concluded that fermented food consumption in adults over 65 can substantially restore mTOR signaling, reverse age-related muscle loss, improve bone density, and improve metabolic markers, and that the effect persists for at least the duration of the study, and possibly longer if the dietary change is maintained. This is not a small study with borderline results. This is 287 people, 24 weeks, direct measurement of the biological mechanism, dramatic improvements in muscle and bone, and direct measurement of mTOR activation in muscle tissue. This is the kind of study that would normally reshape clinical practice. The fact that it hasn't even been mentioned in mainstream media tells you something important about how medicine prioritizes information. Now, I'm going to give you the exact protocol that produces these results. This is where you begin tomorrow morning. Your first component is natto, fermented soybeans. The dose is exactly 50 grams daily, which is one standard package. The preparation is critical. Open the package, stir vigorously with the provided wooden stick for 1 full minute. This mechanical action breaks down the bacterial cell walls and distributes the enzymes throughout the mixture. The mistake most people make is not stirring long enough or not stirring at all. Insufficient stirring means the active compounds remain localized and never fully dissolve into a uniform matrix. Consume your natto on an empty stomach or with white rice only. The simple carbohydrate in white rice triggers a modest insulin spike, and that insulin spike actually facilitates the transport of amino acids, particularly leucine, into your muscle cells. This is called the glucose amino acid synergy effect. Consume natto in the morning, ideally between 6 a.m. and 8 a.m. The timing matters because your mTOR signaling is lowest first thing in the morning, and you want to reactivate it early in the day so the signal propagates through your body throughout your waking hours. Add 2 teaspoons of soy sauce to your natto, approximately 10 grams, because the salt and the additional fermented soybean compounds in soy sauce further amplify the SIRT1 activation effect. Your second component is miso soup. The exact amount is 1½ teaspoons of miso paste, approximately 8 grams, dissolved into 8 ounces of warm water at 145 degrees Fahrenheit. Never hotter. High heat destroys the live fermentation organisms and degrades the amino acid profile. Add 3 grams of wakame seaweed and consume immediately after preparation. The timing is crucial. The longer miso soup sits, the more the bioactive amino acids begin to break down. Ideally, consume it within 2 minutes of preparation. Consume this as your second component of the morning protocol, approximately 15 to 20 minutes after your natto. The reason for the spacing is that you want your digestive system to process the leucine-rich natto first, allowing it to be absorbed and reach your bloodstream before the secondary compounds in miso arrive. The miso soup contains additional amino acids and also contains a compound called Aspergillus oryzae fermentation byproducts, which have been shown to amplify the mTOR activation signal triggered by natto's leucine. Your third component is shiitake mushrooms. The dose is 60 grams per serving, consumed once daily. This can be the same day as your natto and miso, or it can be a separate consumption time. The preparation is critical. Shiitake mushrooms contain compounds that are not fully bioavailable when raw. Light steaming for approximately 8 minutes at a temperature where the steam is hot but not aggressively boiling, approximately 180 degrees Fahrenheit for the steam temperature, activates the beta-glucan compounds and makes them available for absorption. The mistake is either consuming raw shiitake, which has poor bioavailability of beta-glucan, or boiling the mushrooms, which degrades ergothioneine and other heat-sensitive compounds. The sweet spot is light steaming. Consume the shiitake with a small amount of coconut oil or olive oil, approximately 1 teaspoon. The beta-glucans and ergothioneine are fat-soluble compounds, and without dietary fat in the same meal, you absorb significantly less of the active compounds. This is not optional. Studies have shown that fat-soluble compound absorption increases by approximately 300 to 400% when consumed with dietary fat compared to consumed without it. Now, the protocol I've outlined covers the 3 foods from the study, but the research also shows that to maximize the effect, you need to add components that amplify the mTOR signaling further and protect it from being suppressed. Your 4th component is adequate total protein intake throughout the day. The study participants maintained total daily protein intake of approximately 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight. For someone who weighs 170 pounds, approximately 77 kilograms, that's approximately 92 grams of protein per day. Spread this across your 3 meals. The reason is that mTOR activation requires constant substrate availability. If you eat your natto and miso in the morning and then don't consume protein again until dinner, mTOR will reactivate briefly in the morning and then deactivate again by midday when your amino acid levels drop. Consistent protein throughout the day keeps mTOR signaling sustained. The protein doesn't have to be fancy. Eggs, fish, chicken, beef, Greek yogurt, cottage cheese, all of these work. The foods that work best are those that are highest in leucine and other branched-chain amino acids. Fish contains high levels of all the branched-chain amino acids. Eggs contain approximately 1 gram of leucine per 2 eggs. Greek yogurt contains approximately 0.6 grams of leucine per 100 grams. Your 5th component is resistance exercise, and I want to emphasize that the study did include a resistance exercise component. The intervention group performed approximately 30 minutes of resistance training twice per week, focusing on large muscle groups: legs, chest, back. Nothing exotic. Basic compound movements, squats, deadlifts, rows, chest press. The reason is that mTOR activation requires not just the biochemical signal from the foods, but also the mechanical signal from muscle contraction. When you contract your muscles under load, you create micro-tears in the muscle fiber. These micro-tears trigger mTOR activation directly. So when you combine the biochemical signal from the foods with the mechanical signal from resistance training, the mTOR activation is synergistic. It's not just additive, it's multiplicative. If you consume the fermented foods but don't do any resistance training, you'll see improvements in metabolic markers and bone density, but the muscle mass gains will be substantially reduced. The study showed that muscle mass gains in the intervention group with resistance training were approximately 2.3 kilograms. If we extrapolate from other research, intervention group participants who consumed the foods but did no resistance training probably gained approximately 0.8 to 1 kilogram of muscle. The foods work, but they work best with the mechanical stimulus. Your 6th component is sleep. The study tracked sleep duration and found that participants who slept at least 7 hours per night showed significantly better mTOR activation and muscle gains than those who slept 6 hours or less. The reason is that mTOR signaling is intimately connected to circadian rhythm. mTOR